I'd like to thank you all for coming here this evening. It's quite an honor. Our alumni have made remarkable achievements in the public and private realms, in government, business, the arts, nonprofits, and many forms of education. To their honor, we've created a new award this year to recognize their achievements of our many talented alumni. The first annual Social Sciences Division Distinguished Alumni Award. And notice that's first and it's annual, so we're planning on doing this every year. This provides us with an opportunity each year to identify and honor one of our special alumni. The Social Sciences Division today is as large as the whole UC campus was 20 years ago. And our alumni base and their achievements are growing daily. We decided that it was time to recognize this special group of people, and tonight is our first event. Choosing that special alumnus is, of course, a huge challenge, since we have so many distinguished people to choose among. The selection committee put in hard work with so many nominees who are qualified. So I'd like to thank the committee. The committee was made up of 4 alumni and 4 faculty members. The committee solicited input widely from faculty, staff, the UCSC Alumni Association, and many others. I'd also like to thank the divisional staff and the development group's efforts that made this event possible this evening. We are very fortunate to have many distinguished alumni from the Social Sciences Division. But the committee unanimously chose tonight's honoree, Dana Priest. Dana graduated with a degree in politics from Stevenson College in 1981. 20 years ago, she joined the Washington Post as an assistant foreign editor, worked on the metropolitan staff, and then covered regulatory issues and the White House Health Care Initiative. She was the Post's Pentagon correspondent for 6 years, and then wrote exclusively about the military as an investigative reporter. She was one of the first reporters on the ground for the invasion of Panama in 1989, reported on the first Iraq War, and covered the 1999 Kosovo War. For her reporting and insightful articles, Dana has won numerous awards, including the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting and the State Department's Excellence in Journalism Award. 3 years ago, Dana published a book entitled The Mission: Waging War and Keeping Peace with America's Military. This book is about America's growing dependence on our military to manage world affairs. The book describes a clash of culture and purpose through the eyes of the soldiers and officers themselves. The book was stunningly successful, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and won the New York Public Library Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. Jody Williams, Nobel laureate for Peace in 1997, said, "Anyone trying to understand the interplay between the U.S. military and foreign policy must read The Mission." Now to more recent events. Last November, the Washington Post published a front-page article Dana wrote, Above the Fold, on secret extraterritorial interrogation sites run by the CIA. The article triggered a worldwide debate on these so-called black sites. She found that, in addition to Guantanamo Bay detainees in military custody, the CIA held approximately 30 senior members and 100 foot soldiers of the Al-Qaeda and Taliban in facilities around the world. She wrote that several former Soviet bloc countries had allowed the CIA to run interrogation facilities on their territory. As you can imagine, these revelations started a raging debate in this country and in Europe and elsewhere. Just last month, Dana won the George Polk Award for national reporting for her work on these secret CIA detention facilities and rendition policies. And tonight, please join me in welcoming and honoring the first winner of the Distinguished Social Sciences Division Alumni Award, Ms. Dana Priest. Well, we can all go home now. Thank you so much. No, of course, we're so very fortunate that Dana has agreed to speak with us this evening, and following her talk, have some time for questions and answers. During the question and answer time, please come to the microphone, identify yourselves, and speak clearly. Thank you. Dana.
Thank you. Here, why don't you take that? Oh, I'm so glad to be here. I feel like I have to explain the apparatus. The cover story is that I had knee surgery from running too much, but the real story is that the CIA has a special ray gun that it's experimented with. I came to town, I feel like I have to sort of do truth in advertising, so I wanted to start off by saying, you know, what does $2 buy you these days? Parking at UC Santa Cruz, and probably $50,000 a year gets you a year's worth of education. But what is this worth? A photograph as an undergraduate, 20 years younger than I actually am. I'd call that priceless. So, so that's what greeted me when I came to Santa Cruz. You know, I thought what I would do tonight is to sort of try to bring you along with me how this war on terror story that includes the prisons unfolded, because it wasn't at all evident in the beginning what I was looking at. And so I just thought I'd sort of bring you along in that evolution, and you can see it as much as you can from my point of view. You know, in the first year after 9/11, most reporters at national newspapers were really consumed with the whole other set of questions, like what was this plot against us? Who were Al-Qaeda? You know, how did we miss it? What was this war in Afghanistan all about? And then we rushed into Afghanistan to try to figure out how was the war being waged there. There were actually a lot of secrets that we uncovered pretty quickly to determine that it wasn't a conventional war in any sense of the way, that the CIA, working with a really small group of special forces, had aligned with the Northern Alliance to conduct a very unconventional war supported by a lot of air power, and really was very unconventional in every way. And as a military reporter, I was already covering the CIA by that time, and I knew a little bit about their operations there, and quickly began to realize that when the government speaks about a war on terror, they have organized themselves to prosecute a war with new laws and different kinds of forces. So although it was a big revelation to reporters to be able to understand how the war was being prosecuted in Afghanistan, the real war on terror is really led by the CIA. And since I was a CIA reporter, it fell to me to first understand this. And then immediately, once I realized that this war is really prosecuted by the agency, I couldn't help but apply some of the same types of basic questions to this war and to the CIA as I did to covering military campaigns like the Kosovo Air War, which was the last war prior to 9/11 that I covered as a Pentagon correspondent. And you know, some of the basic questions were, how is the CIA fighting this war? You know, what are its weapons? Where's the battlefield? What's its chain of command? What authorities does it have to conduct more unconventional ways? What are the rules that it's using? I quickly learned, of course, that most of what it does, it operates as a covert action, which under Title 50, which gives it a whole set of special authorities that are very difficult to explain. But also just basically, how effective are they? You know, Clausewitz said war is politics by other means, and so were they going to help us achieve those other means? Was the way they're prosecuting the war going to be overall effective towards achieving our strategic goals? And besides, what were those strategic goals? The United States wanted to kill or neutralize or capture, take off the battlefield, the pre-9/11 Al-Qaeda that helped to actually undertake that plot. But now we know logically that the other goals include minimizing or eliminating, if that's at all possible, Al-Qaeda, transnational terrorism at large. And to use the Cold War analogy, really as a strategic goal, to be able to win in the war of ideology against radical Islam/terrorism. So again, I'm looking at it with my military hat on, saying the CIA is running this war and it's doing whatever it's doing, and is that going to achieve what we all think that it should achieve? Right away, it leads you to an area that you're not supposed to be in, which is a classified area. You know, it's hard enough to report on the military war, certainly during the time of war, but usually what we do is go back after a war has ended and recreate things and interview people when they're not in the heat of battle, and then we discover a lot more about what happened. In this war, and because it's the CIA, that was all off limits. So it made the job much harder and remains very difficult to undertake. But, you know, tried nonetheless, and pretty soon discovered that, of course, we all know this, right after 9/11, George Bush declared war on Al-Qaeda. This creates a framework, a legal framework, that makes all the things the CIA does underneath the surface legal. In terms of the government's legality. Only 3 days after he declared war on Al-Qaeda, Congress passed a War Powers Resolution giving the President the authority to use all means necessary to destroy the people and networks responsible for attacking the United States. And they gave the President the authority to determine who exactly those enemies are. This authority came up recently in the debate over the NSA warrantless wiretaps, where Congress said, "Oh, we didn't mean that." Well, if you look at the resolution, it's huge. It's very broad, and it gives the president a huge amount of authority to determine who the enemy is. And so I think Congress is sort of rewriting their own history on that. About 8 days after the September 11th attack, the president did another thing that was very significant in this, which he signed what's called a presidential finding. And that's required under the covert action rule to undertake a covert action. The president has to sign this, and it can't be contrary to U.S. law, but there's a bevy of lawyers that determine, you know, whether that's true or not. And the intelligence committees have to be informed pretty quickly about covert actions, but in this case, because of the sensitivity, that's their version of it, the entire intelligence committees were not informed of these things, but it was a very select number of people, 4 to 8 leaders of the intelligence committees. So once they had this was a hugely broad covert finding that basically says, do whatever it takes to eliminate them, either kill them, capture them, we need to interrogate them, but it was really a very broadly stated thing. What happened after that was George Tenet, the director of the CIA, began putting in place what I think, and what I've written, what I think has become the largest covert action program since the height of the Cold War. Larger than the covert war in Afghanistan, the CIA's involvement in Central America. It goes by the initials, which I've used in the paper, GST, and it has many different components. And so I went about trying to discover what some of those components were. And one other thing that I discovered is that each of those components, no matter how strange they seemed once we discovered them and wrote about them, or how unusual, they too were all legalized by the government, by a group of government attorneys who largely worked in a very small office called the Office of Legal Counsel, which is a part of the Justice Department. It's the part that really weighs in on government actions and decides whether an action the government is about to take is legal or not. So counterterrorism used to be the purview of the criminal division in justice, and those people looked at counterterrorism more like a crime, and and they could judge it on that, in that way. But the Office of Legal Counsel, where I think the most famous person out of that office is John Yoo, who teaches at Berkeley now. He and others, including the vice president's lawyer, David Addington, really formed a small group, a cabal of attorneys who all saw certain things similarly and that are important to understanding how they made all this legal, which is they have a view of executive power and the power of the president in time of war that's, I don't want to say it's extreme because I'm not putting a value judgment on it, but it is in recent history, it is an extreme version of it. And to summarize it very briefly, it says, in time of war, you need one commander-in-chief because it's a chaotic situation, you need to take decisions quickly. And that person is the president. And because it's a time of war, not even Congress can step in and overrule the president on what he wants to do in order to prosecute this war. And even some of the laws that are on the books can be ignored in time of war. If Congress really doesn't like something, they still have the power of the purse and they can cut off funding for it. So they had a very aggressive view of executive power. And that's how you get things like the torture memo, which was a memo that I unearthed a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, that defined torture in a very unconventional way. And basically it said anything that doesn't result in organ failure, in permanent physical or mental damage, or in death, anything short of that is not torture. It could be cruel and inhumane treatment, but it's not torture. And the penalties for torture are very different than cruel and inhumane treatment. And they use this executive power argument. So they really were using this to legalize something that had not been legal before. One of my other favorite examples of this is the change from the term assassination to targeted killing. And as you know, it's illegal to assassinate people, but in post 9/11, the view was that Al-Qaeda had attacked the United States, and therefore we were defending the United States, and therefore it was no longer an assassination to go kill somebody with a predator, an unmanned drone armed with Hellfire missiles. That was actually a targeted killing in defense of your own country. So you see other changes like that. Interrogations, that was another component that I unearthed eventually. And put yourself in their shoes for a minute. You have this attack, you think there's going to be another attack, and you start to capture people in Afghanistan fleeing to Pakistan or in other places who you know for certain, in many cases, are the leaders of Al-Qaeda, like Abu Zubaydah, or have been involved with the plot, the 9/11 plot. And you think they have information that is going to set off a next attack soon. So what do? You don't have interrogators because the CIA was not in that business by then, and it hadn't been for 2 decades or more. So they sent teams of psychologists, polygraphers, and doctors to go into the field and start interrogating these people. And when they got people like Abu Zubaydah and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and they really wanted to, and they weren't cooperating, they wanted to be able to go farther coercively, and came back to the CIA lawyers. My point here is that they were not doing things in a rogue manner. This was all signed off on. They came back to the CIA lawyers and said, how far can we go? And the CIA lawyers went to the Office of Legal Counsel at the White House, and they came up with a set of what they call enhanced interrogation techniques. Some of those techniques include stress positions, liquid diets, bombardment with light or sound, cold, hot, and the most famous one that we've heard about is waterboarding, when you're pretending to drown somebody, and most effectively used in combination with each other and repetitively. So they got the okay to use this on the first big Al-Qaeda capture that they had, and then they sort of ran with it. They thought that this would be effective for other high-value targets, is what their term is, and so they applied those to them. At the same time, where are you going to put these people? And that's where the whole transportation system, the secret airplanes that we've now all written about, come into play, because you have to logistically get them somewhere secretly. And then where are you going to keep them? And that's where the black sites come in. My first exposure to the fact that there might be such a thing was in Afghanistan, when I discovered that the CIA had built a little facility that was totally off limits to the military but was co-located with the military. And you wrap all these things together, and as a reporter you're really getting the picture here that this is a new world. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I sure want to describe it to you. And that became kind of my mission, was to do that. And over the course of 2 years, I then discovered, and it really did take that long, these stories were very difficult to produce finally and to source correctly. But over the course of 2 years, I found prisons in Afghanistan. The New York Times wrote about one in Thailand, Egypt and Jordan. They aren't quite black sites, but they're sites in which the CIA, working with the host government, interrogates people. And then finally the one in Eastern Europe, or the several in Eastern European democracies, which for us sort of had a new quality about it, because the previous prisons were located in countries where we either were the government, that was Afghanistan, or the governments weren't really governments that were democracies, and certainly the conventional Western sense of rule of law was not in operation. But here in Eastern Europe, that was not the case. You had countries emerging as democracies under the rule of law, agreeing to host these facilities, and these facilities would be illegal in those countries under their law, not illegal under our law because it was a covert action that was signed off, but illegal under their law. The other thing that was going on, and this was important, it's not gotten nearly as much attention as the black site story, but it's what I spent even more time on, was to understand the larger shift that was happening with the CIA. After 9/11, there was George Tenet had already put in place this thing he called the Worldwide Threat Matrix. It involved 80 countries. And the idea was if you invaded Afghanistan and it was like hammering it, people would squirt out all over the world, and where would they go? Because you wanted to figure out where would they go, because you wanted to be able to be there when they got there and stop them and detain them. So they had a priority list, and they included countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Somalia, Pakistan, Uzbekistan. Saudi Arabia, of course, is a priority, but the Saudis said, no way, you're not coming in here. So what they ended up doing is Yemen would also be on that list, because they ended up going to the countries who border Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the agency internally is changing quite a bit. It used to be that if you moved up in the hierarchy of the CIA, you eventually could become a division chief, and there are geographic divisions. You headed the European division, or the Latin America division, or the Asia division, and that's where all the power resided. On 9/11, that all changed, and the power began to reside, and still does, in the Counterterrorist Center, which doesn't sound like a real big deal if you're not inside, but to them it was a real big deal, in part because the Counterterrorist Center used to be sort of a throwaway. It was a place that you put people if you didn't want them really anymore in your division. All of a sudden, that's the place to be, and it got huge funding increases and tripled in size. And at the same time, there was a shift. At the same time that there was a shift away from the geographic divisions to the Counterterrorist Center, there was also a really fundamental shift in the mission of the CIA. It went from being an agency whose central mission was to conduct espionage, to basically steal secrets from other countries or networks of people, and by and large using the embassy as cover and diplomatic relations as a way to make contact with people who you could eventually bribe to get these secrets or help you out. After 9/11, though, the emphasis became much more on what I call a paramilitary emphasis, where really the emphasis was these individuals throughout the world, how could you find them, how could you surveil them, how could you destroy their financial network, their logistics support base, and then ultimately, how do you get rid of them? How do you take them off the street? And that's where you came to the detaining and interrogating part of it. And so the Special Activities Division, which is the paramilitary division within the CIA, also grew enormously from a very small group to a fairly large group. I don't really know how large, but in the hundreds. The other dynamic that was going on during this period, which drove the government crazy, is the fact that it's hard to keep a secret these days. You know, even though they try and all these things are, most of them are classified, reporters who cover national security are more experienced at it, they've been at it longer, they have more contacts, and they can use databases. I mean, the amount of information you can get off a database now is really pretty phenomenal. We used to talk about the CNN effect in war, which was, and it drove the generals crazy because the CNN cameras would show up at every collateral damage, you know, every accident in which, or mishap in which the bomb went to the wrong place and civilians were killed, CNN would show up. Or they'd show up, you know, after they learned to use CNN, and they would tell them to go to a certain location. In fact, on the opening night of the Kosovo War, the CNN happened to show up at the oil depot that they bombed. And the whole point was that the explosion would be huge, and it would be televised, and that explosion and drama would send a message to the Serbs that, you know, we're serious and we're going to create a lot of damage, even though, you know, in the scheme of things, it didn't create that much damage. So the CNN effect was used by everybody. I haven't really named it. I mean, I could call it the Google effect, but that doesn't really explain it well enough because, but the same thing is going on now. And my favorite, but in the realm of secrecy, my favorite example of this is the first story that eventually led us to understand that there were such things as renditions going on was it was located in a paper in Islamabad called The Dawn in Islamabad, and a local reporter there had done a small story saying that this Yemeni microbiologist named Jamal Mohammed had been seen being whisked away at night in a strange part of the airport by a Gulfstream 5 aircraft. And so this journalist, put that fact in the paper, the Gulfstream, the tail number of the Gulfstream, put it all in the paper in the Dawn of Islamabad. 8 hours later, on a conservative website that I can't remember the name right now, but 8 hours later, there's a chat on that website, and they said, tail number 379 belongs to a company located in Dedham, Massachusetts named Premier Executive Transport. Boy, does that sound like Air America or what? That's what they're saying on this chat site. Air America was the CIA's, one of their supply lines into Cambodia during the Vietnam War. So already, you know, 8 hours later, you got this discussion going. And then what happens? Reporters like myself go to the courthouse in Boston, which is near Dedham, and pull the corporate records on Premier Executive Transport. And it is amazing what you can get out of corporate records, even old ones like they had there. You can get the names of all of the officers. So what did I do with that? I went back to my researcher with 8 names of people, and what did she find? None of those people really exist. They don't have, they all have Social Security, they were all in their 40s and 50s, but they had all of them Social Security numbers given to them in the late 90s and early 2002. None of them had any record of addresses or phone numbers anywhere, no credit cards, nothing. Then we found, that from using, again, public records and databases, we found post office boxes that all of those people listed somewhere on those corporate records. And the post office boxes, which we could also look behind in our database, found 352 names. And so that's an awful lot. So we took a representative sample and we put those in the database in the same way. And I'll never forget the day my researcher, Julie Tate, came over and she said, you know, she was really nervous about it. She said, this is so weird. You know, none of these people exist. I'm afraid I'm not pushing some right button because, you know, maybe they do exist. But it was just so bizarre. And what we had found is, front companies and fake names that were used by the agency. So what we did was we told the agency, we were going to write this story, and we showed them, we made a schema with the boxes and the names and, you know, brought it there and said, look what they found, and well, look what we found, and, you know, they basically said no comment. But that formed part of our story. We didn't actually put the location of or the names of the post office boxes in the paper because we weren't sure what all those names really did. And fact is that they could be covers for operations that we don't want to blow, especially if we don't know what they are. Well, this whole thing about airplanes more than the post office boxes has just now grown in Europe like wildfire. Every reporter on National Security Beat in every European country is now gotten the tail numbers of every plane with the help of another group of people who are the plane scanners. There's actually hobbyists who stand at the end of runways with binoculars. They did this long before 9/11, and they watch the planes fly away, and then they'll put them in the database, and then someone else will watch it land. So you have this whole hobby network that existed before 9/11 that became really helpful to us and who we made contact with, and they provided the first unofficial flight logs for that one plane and for many other planes after that. Well, now that people know that these are CIA planes, you know, there are 10 times as many plane spotters around, and I get sent pictures of these planes, you know, all the time saying, it's landed here, it's landed there. And I think it's actually a little bit off base because a lot of those planes do nothing but transport, you know, officials around. But it's become sort of a symbol of, wow, this war is weird and different, and the CIA is really involved in it, and we don't know if it's good or bad, but it doesn't feel comfortable to a lot of people. And Europe is also investigating the prison sites because that is contrary not only to the laws of those particular countries, but also to the European Union's human rights laws and those sorts of things. So, however, the plane story was not the Eureka moment for me. The Eureka moment in my reporting on this, and neither were the black sites and neither were the renditions, the Eureka moment was much more subtle in a way. And it's when I really realized that the war on terrorism really is a global war, and it really involves a very deep set of relationships between the CIA and foreign liaison services. If you think about it, how would you go find and capture a terrorist somewhere? Would you, you know, send a man or woman who looks kind of like me or you, who speaks maybe classical Arabic into a place where they're going to speak some dialect of Arabic, maybe, or you know, Pashtun or one of the languages that we barely have any speakers, and who doesn't understand the subtleties of a culture? Would you send them in to figure out, you know, where one individual is? No, you would go and ask Yemen to find the Yemeni microbiologist. But you don't really have a relationship with the intelligence services in Yemen because it's always been a country that you are a little bit worried about because they support terror. I mean, there's a lot of terrorists in Yemen. It was Osama bin Laden's birthplace, and it has a huge no man's land on the border. So what they did was set about to create, and George Tenet was very good at this, to create a whole other set of relationships that didn't exist before 9/11 with a whole range of countries. Some of them we have very questionable relationships with for obvious, you know, human rights reasons, or in the Yemen case for their support of terrorism. And that to me was that to me was the Eureka moment, because I started really getting examples of this to show that that we were spending a huge amount of money pouring into the development of these relationships, The whole point of which is to create a seamless flow of information, and then a group that can decide what to do with it. The CIA, with Congress's help, poured, I think, billions of dollars into this, willing to train foreign intelligence services, to give them kind of whatever they wanted in the beginning to get this going, SUVs, night vision goggles. In Yemen's case, they wanted special forces training. They brought intelligence people from all, Uzbekistan, Indonesia, Pakistan to the United States to train at the CIA facility. And they created, eventually, more than 24 counterterrorist intelligence centers around the world that exist now, where CIA case officers and analysts sit side by side with foreign liaison officers on a daily basis, trying to locate and then decide what to do about suspected terrorists in their country. And one of my favorite examples of this, and this, drives home the point that the world is not what it seems. That's kind of a simple statement, and I would have thought by now, 20 years as a reporter, that would not be a big surprise. But it was a big surprise, because you really, as writing about the military, you get into real deeply into national security issues, and you think you understand how the world operates. But covering the CIA, I really had to step back and say, this is really different. I'll give you my favorite example is, at the same time that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was standing up bashing the French for not wanting to join the U.S. effort against Iraq, and senators were, banning the word French fries and promoting freedom fries. At that same time period, the French were aside from the British, the French were the second most helpful country in terms of working with the CIA. So much so that there's the one and only multilateral counterterrorist intelligence center in the world exists in Paris. It's secret. They would never talk about it. They will never confirm it. And I wrote a story about it on the front page, and all the papers picked it up, and they still wouldn't confirm it. It's mainly funded by the CIA, and it gathers together all of the countries, not all, but many of the countries in Europe. And the point is for them to share information with one another about suspects. And in a case like Germany, where the laws really restrict the sharing of intelligence and police information, they're able to get that information shared through this workaround, sort of is one way to look at it, through this intelligence center. So again, while France is being bashed and taking it, I mean, they're standing up and saying, you're crazy and our position is right. They're not saying, yeah, but what about all that great work we're doing with you? No one ever mentions that. The French allowed the Predator, the armed Predator, which was a big deal at the time that it first was used, to fly out of a base in Djibouti that they owned. And that Predator was responsible for killing a number of suspected terrorists in the Yemeni desert in 2002, including a naturalized U.S. citizen. They never said a word about it. They absolutely don't want you and I to know that they're cooperating in that way, but they are. So that is, to me, the big revelation is really how, you can see it if you're reading the current press on the German controversy over the fact that Germany also would not go to war in Iraq with the United States, but German intelligence officials passed some really key targeting data to the CIA before the war. And this, threatens to unseat the German government, but it's nonetheless the case. So really, the allies in Europe in particular have been very cooperative with the agency in these counterterrorism efforts. So if you do an assessment of what has all this gotten you, good, bad, your goal, away from your goal, what I would say is this. The vast majority of the 3,000 or so al-Qaeda terrorists that were captured since 9/11 have been captured or killed because of the CIA working with the liaison organization. And about 3/4 of al-Qaeda, pre-9/11 al-Qaeda, leadership are probably dead or in some black site or in some other prison where they'll never get out. you could look at that as the good news. On the bad news side is the fact that Iraq has created a new terrorist training ground and recruiting tool that is in many ways much more potent than bin Laden's ideology alone. The CIA says this in a very cautious but clear way in its 2020 report looking into the future. And if you add that with the scandals, the Abu Ghraib scandals, the secret prisons, and other abuse scandals, I think that we have now taken, for every one step forward we took in finding the people responsible for 9/11, we've taken 2 steps, if not many more, backwards in having created a new target, not just for al-Qaeda, but for any group that thinks like they do, as well as individuals who now do not need to have pledged jihad with al-Qaeda, do not need bin Laden or Zawahiri to send a message saying, go attack. It's enough that they share the ideology, that they are able and willing and are, as we saw in the London bombing, using terrorist tactics against Western interests, and the U.S. in particular. So that's the bad news. So are we safer? You know, I think there are those 2 things to consider, and they're very different. One is short-term, yes, I think so, or definitely we're more aware of things in the United States, but in the long term, you know, I think that you will see this problem of new networks, individual terrorists willing to do anything they can against the United States. Now, the one other point that I wanted to make, which I'm sort of, this has become my hobby horse now, is that all the things that I talked about tonight, every single one of them, the secret prisons, the renditions, the airplanes, the new legal authority, the torture memo, the torturing, or the enhanced interrogation techniques, every single one of those facts is now known because of the news media, not because of a government hearing, a whistleblower who went to Capitol Hill and somehow it got out to the media, not because the government, like in the Abu Ghraib case, was forced to come and testify openly about their tactics. On the contrary, in the CIA case, there have been zero, not one public hearing on any of the issues that I talked about today, and I don't think there ever will be, because they are covert programs, and they won't confirm them. So what I'm actually doing is sort of making a case for the mainstream media. We don't really like to stand up and defend ourselves because it's not really what we do. But none of this you would have none of this to mull over and to think about without the mainstream media. I know that blogging has become very, popular these days, and most blogs still use facts that they get from the mainstream media, and then they opinionate about them, and they're very popular. So what you have is 2 converging bad pressures on the mainstream media. One is from the bloggers on the right and the left, and they don't have to be bloggers, people on the right and the left who think that we're not doing the job, and we don't do a great job, but we do an okay job, but they don't think so, and they're leaving us. The other pressure is from the government, and this pressure is, I think, as strong as it was. It has never been stronger since probably the Nixon administration. The government would like us to stop reporting on these issues, and it's willing to mount pressure to make that happen. Possibly, as you know, the Justice Department is investigating the NSA stories, and the CIA is investigating the secret prison story. So combination of the government pressure on one side and readers leaving the mainstream media on the other side could result in a weakened media. For one thing, newspapers aren't doing so well financially. I can envision a time where the news staff gets smaller, where the investigative staff that produces a lot of this stuff gets smaller, and therefore you will have fewer avenues to actually, you'll have fewer reporters and fewer newspapers who are confident enough to stand up to the government and say, well, we're going to make our own decision on this. We think this is valuable to know. So, as you know, Donald Rumsfeld and the president both called this a long war, speaking about the war on terrorism. And, my goal is to get people to appreciate, with all of its warts, the value of having a vibrant national security press corps who is willing to delve into these issues, because the alternative is really not good. So with that, I will leave it to questions. Thank you.
You didn't mention anything about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and also that I don't think there was any connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. And
Right.
we can admit that. So we're talking about a war on terror. There really wasn't a war on terror reason to go into Iraq.
Right.
And yet, that even dwarfs everything we've done in Afghanistan and everything else. I mean, that's the big elephant,
Right.
in a sense. So are we wrong to think that perhaps this administration used the war on terror to go through a wish list that they had of things that they wanted before 9/11, that 9/11 allowed them to have? And I think that, when you say that the Congress really did give the power to spy, but maybe didn't know it, and they should look at themselves, that's a tricky issue when the president and the administration actually went back and asked for that power and was turned down on the power, and then later on said, oh, we already had the power. That's a tricky issue, especially when Rockefeller writes the letter, puts it in the safe, I don't like any of this
Right.
already. For you to say Congress should have known better, they're rewriting history, that's tricky.
Well, okay, let me.
But anyway, are we wrong to be suspicious that this administration kind of took terrorism, I mean, because of really attacking Iraq with no terrorists there, that they really wanted, with PNAC and some of these other things, that they wanted to be able to spy. They wanted to take away some of these rights. They wanted to run some of these prisons and do some of these things. Are we wrong to kind of think that there was alternative motives in this whole war on terror, especially after the 9/11 Commission comes back and says,
Right, I got your
you're
main
getting F
points.
and Ds and other things.
Okay, I see three separate questions there. Well, I'll limit it to three separate questions. The first is the WMD issue, and probably the question is, why did we do the job we did on that? And and so we've looked at that a lot internally and said to ourselves, did we do the right thing? Did we not do things we should have done? And what we found, and I was very involved with the WMD reporting leading up to the war, was that the Washington Post in particular, wrote many stories that cast doubt on the claims of the administration that the nuclear program was as far along as it was, or even the chemical and biological program. They were really hard stories to do because the intelligence community, well, the head of the intelligence community, George Tenet, was pretty much with the president on going to war in Iraq. So finding sources was made all the more difficult, but we did find them. What we found when we look back on it, and it was a very frustrating time for me and other people, was that many of those stories were not played on the front page, and actually that really matters. But the other thing that I think really matters is even the stories that are played on the front page, when you look at the reaction and the public reaction about contrast, a handful of stories saying the administration is exaggerating, because we did use that word many times, exaggerating the claim on nuclear development, versus the administration who's out in every form they can on the public, on TV mainly, saying the things that they were saying that were exaggerations or that were leaving out all the caveats for weapons of mass destruction. Who do you think, sort of breaks through? It's really not the several news stories, even a dozen or so news stories that cast doubt on it. It's their ability to use the podium so effectively and to get on the airwaves. And so I think that, and the fact that there wasn't an opposition party that stood up ever and said, well, wait a minute. The intelligence community produced a 92-page national intelligence estimate on Iraq, and it had all the caveats in there. They weren't highlighted, but they were in there, mainly in the footnotes. Any member of Congress could have read that, and they couldn't go and take their staff because it was in a special room. They couldn't take notes. They would actually have to walk over there themselves unescorted and read it. And one of my favorite stories that I did was how there were a handful only of senators who bothered to read the National Intelligence Estimate before voting on the war resolution. Same with House. So I think they also fell down on the job in trying to figure out, are there weapons or not. On the 9/11 Iraq case, this is even clearer. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we and others said when especially Cheney would go on Meet the Press, is usually when they did it, Meet the Press or other programs, and either directly, but it was often insinuated in a really graceful way, that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. How many times we would reiterate the fact that there's no evidence to that, and that is a community-wide intelligence view. Still, there's a poll recently that said the majority of troops over there believe that there was a connection, and at the time, probably, if you polled the American people, they believed there was a connection. So it's not that, we weren't reporting it, it just it didn't get through. And I've only answered 2, but of course now there is a terrorist threat from Iraq, that's clear. And, the transition rhetoric was, let's fight them, or we're going to fight them in Iraq so they don't come here. Well, that was a very clever way of spinning a situation that they never anticipated. Because had they anticipated that Iraq would become a hub for terrorists, my bet is they would have had many more troops, many different kinds of equipment and troops there to do something about it. Instead, it caught them totally off guard, and now it's just a great rhetorical tool that has become a reality for many people that, yeah, you fight them in Iraq so that you don't fight them in the United States, and that's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Iraq now is a hotbed for terrorists, a recruiting place, a safe haven because of the chaos. So, so that's my answer to that.
Hello, and thank you for your visit. I might read this. In terms of these sort of CIA tricks, these new tricks that you referred to, and the redefining of the CIA in the last few years, and also taking into account the media uncovering a lot of these tricks, and not Congress, and Congress also passing these wide, broad pieces of legislation. To what degree is this a potentially a deep systemic issue, and in such a, perhaps government complicity? What is your feeling as to these tricks sort of transcending this administration? Yeah,
well, that's a good question, because I do think it is all a systemic issue. It's in part the issue is still on the part of the, so let's put it, where are the checks on this? I mean, how are the checks and balances supposed to work? We're part of the checks and balances, but if you put things in a classified form, we become less so because we don't have access to much of that. And then you have a check and balance that really relies on a small number of people in the intelligence committees who have all the clearances they need to see these things and to judge them. The administration decided to only brief 4 to 8 people. Sometimes you hear the gang of 4 and sometimes the gang of 8. And you saw that with the Rockefeller letter that you referred to. Rockefeller gets briefed on this program. He's not allowed to have his lawyer there, his chief of staff. He can't, I guess he could make those notes to himself later, put them in the vault. So how is Rockefeller, who's on 5 other committees and not an intelligence expert and not a lawyer, supposed to figure out for himself whether this is legal or not? So what happens? They don't push it. I mean, they might say now, and I do think that's true, that they would go back and say, well, let me ask you one more question about that, or are you sure that's legal? And when they would do that, what would they get? We are positive, these are the lawyers that vetted this, and this is why it's legal. So in that sense, oversight by Congress is really the Achilles heel. And because, it's one reason is because the Intel committees are still so timid, but the other reason is that we have, for all intents and purposes, a one-party elected one-party system who is not going to really challenge the president because he's the same party. I mean, that's not, it happens with Democratic, majorities too, but, and you have the fear factor, and then on top of that, you have people who are, I think, intimidated by, being called traitors. When you question something, even in the most innocent and good-hearted way, you can risk, as a politician in particular, the administration calling you a traitor. And look what they said about the New York Times, that story only aided the enemy. And my retort to that is, if you think so little of the enemy, that you think they don't think that their emails and cell phones are being monitored, you've underestimated who they are, and how are you ever going to defeat them if you think they're that backwards, when, to the contrary, they're very sophisticated use of the internet and all sorts of trickery on their part to be able to communicate with one another. So I do think it's systemic. The State Department plays a very minute role in all of this. So when you look at the strategic goal of eliminating terrorism some way, either militarily or by the force of, ideology and by non-military methods, then you look at the tool that the United States government has that is the non-military foreign policy tool, and that leads you to a State Department that is minuscule in terms of resources, in terms of discipline of its own officers or employees, and and its standing in the Congress and in view of the American people is nowhere near the standing of the military. So, guess who has the most influence? And one of the favorite, and the military knows this and doesn't necessarily like it. One of my favorite expressions that some general told me one day was, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that pretty much sums it up. And we have huge hammers, we're well-funded, and so every problem, from terrorism to whatever, to insurgency, to local indigenous grievances, becomes a military threat. And that's because you have the military trying to judge the situation, and they're trained in a certain way. So definitely systemic.
I guess someone said that you were the lapdog of the administration. Well, it seems to me that you're more the attack dog on the administration. So thank you so much.
Okay.